You've been known primarily as a comic actor, which is inaccurate because you play all kinds of roles. But I wonder if you feel that you've ever had a part like this one that uses as many different aspects of your talent.
Well, this is a 30-hour movie I've appeared in, you know, so a lot has gone down with this one character. Excuse me, I've never been the protagonist really, you know. I have my own plot and so forth. So there's a lot of different angles there. I mean, I've done other parts that meant a great deal to me. I played Arthur Shubershevsky in the original production of Superior Donuts at Steppenwolf and then in New York, and that was okay. And that was kind of a remarkable thing to do. But that's 2.5 hours of your time. Mm-hmm. This is a series is something different, and these guys kept throwing me a lot of yummy curves, and it was really fun to swing for the fences once in a while. Mm.
So, Peter, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how Jimmy came to be Jimmy before he was Saul, and how he ended up with a brother, and just the whole origins of this character.
You know, I think the two things are, in my mind, they're really interlocked, because Vince and I, well, actually, the whole show started off as a writer's room joke. We introduced Saul Goodman on Breaking Bad, and the joke in the writer's room forever after was that there was something that wasn't serious enough or just didn't quite fit into Breaking Bad. Oh, we'll save that for the Saul Goodman show. And I really did think it was a joke because it was too good to be true, because I was lucky enough to be, you know, the writer who had originated the character. Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, everything comes out of the writer's room together, but I was the lucky one who got to write the original Saul Goodman script. And so it seemed too good to be true. And then once we got serious about it towards the end of Breaking Bad, I'll synopsize a lot of the process, but I think the great challenge for us was, and we've talked a lot about the tone of the show, but I think really the great challenge was finding humanity in the character and finding a way that, I don't know how to put this except to say, the way that he could be hurt. Saul Goodman felt like you could take money away from him, you could take his life away from him, but you couldn't really hurt his feelings, you know. And by asking ourselves, you know, how did this guy? We knew his last name was McGill. We didn't know what his first name was. He never said on Breaking Bad. We started asking ourselves, how do you become this character? And we went back in time, and once we opened the writer's room, we hadn't finished the process. But before we opened the writer's room, we did have a key element, which was who does he care about? Who's in his life? And that was when we had the thought of a brother. And one of the things that was on our mind was, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Crumb.
Yes.
And we thought about, you know, you meet R. Crumb, and he seems like this wildly eccentric guy, and then you meet his brother, who is arguably, Charles Crumb, who is arguably every bit as brilliant, and in his own way more so, but is so troubled. And the relationship between the brothers fascinated us. And we didn't base Charles at all on Charles Crumb at all, but just the idea of having somebody who he had to take care of. I think that was the original idea, that would give this character humanity if he had someone who mattered to him. And so we had this idea of having an allergy to electricity. We had the idea of having a character who was greatly accomplished as a lawyer. And then really almost as soon as we thought of the idea, Vince said, I think he's been talking about Michael ever since we started Breaking Bad. We always talked about Michael to bring him in on Breaking Bad in a role.
Did you think about what part he might have played?
There were different thoughts, and it never quite gelled, thank God. It never quite gelled, but it's somebody we all, that could have worked. It would have been, see that, you know, you think that's a ridiculous idea, but there's no ridiculous ideas in the writer's room. But you know, when we cast Michael, Michael brought something to the character that that we didn't anticipate. When we wrote that original scene that was in the very first episode, where Chuck says, I will get better. I'm going to get better. I'm going to turn this thing around. I pictured that when I heard it in my head. It was very different from the way Michael performed it. And I remember being on the set in episode 1 of Better Call Saul and hearing not just not a weak person at all, not even a troubled person, but a person to be reckoned with. And Michael brought that element to the character. And the way Michael plays Chuck, he's an imposing character. He is a character of great depth and passion and pride. And once we saw that, it changed the whole way the series went, actually, and the whole way we conceived of the character. And so we started writing to that. And I think up to that point, we had always asked ourselves, what does Chuck mean to Jimmy? We really felt Chuck was someone, as I said, someone to take care of, someone who we cared about, someone who could be hurt, someone who was wounded in some way. But then we said to ourselves, what does Jimmy mean to Chuck? And what is it like for this man who is so brilliant, who is quoting Latin in the very first episode, who is a little bit of a teacher with Jimmy even in some point? What is it like to have this ne'er-do-well younger brother? And that's the thing I have to say I love about, Michael talks about it as a 30-hour movie. It's a long story. But the great thing about writing a long story isn't just that you can write a long story, is that the story and the characters can talk back to you. And we get to watch what the actors do and not change what we had in mind necessarily, but deepen it. And I think that's, I don't even know if that answers your question, but that's a story about Better
Beautifully
Call Saul.
dodged,
Better Call Saul and Chuck, yes. Thank you.
When you first read the character of Chuck on the page, what was your impression of him as a human being?
Well, I had heard initially that the character was suffering from something that kept him in the house. And the nightmare was that I had head-to-toe psoriasis or something that was going to mean like 8 hours in makeup every time I shot. So I was delighted that it was something as benign as that problem. I just thought it was a very interesting character. I didn't know where it was going to go. But certainly knowing, I was a huge Breaking Bad fan, and knowing what I knew about Saul Goodman and how, and that the story was going to be in large part about how Jimmy arrived at Saul Goodman. I didn't see the blueprint. I just saw, I just kind of deliver what was delivered unto me. I just, interpret the best I can. So I didn't know, it was all a mystery to me. And it was kind of a nice mystery because life is really like that. You don't know what's going to happen when you turn a corner. And it's kind of like that where you don't know when you get, script number 6, you don't know what that's going to be about. And every now and then they'd give me a shout. And they'd say, Vince and Peter would be on the phone. They'd say, yeah, we're in the writer's room. We just wanted to give you the heads up about something.
Yeah.
And it was in, I guess, 9 or 10 in the first season when it was like, yeah, we're going to see what Chuck's really made of. And I had some suspicions, but it was really kind of, oh, man, that's good. That's juicy. I'm going to get that all over my clothes. That's great. Because actors like to play in the dirt, And,
what was it specifically?
Well, it was the scene between Jimmy and Chuck where he basically says, yeah, I've been dynamiting you. I've been rat fucking you, and this is, this is who I really am. This is what I really think of you. You're not a real lawyer.
Yeah,
and
that's a painful scene.
Yeah, it was beautiful to do. I mean, it was.
Because that's ammunition. It was really fun.
There is something about that sense of authority, that sense of strength comes through, and it's interesting that you mentioned he's like a teacher. There's something, you sort of clarified a reaction that I have to this character that I've never really been able to put into words before, which is when I'm watching the show, not only do I want Jimmy to get Chuck's approval, but I feel like I also want Chuck's approval. Like, that's how strong that feeling is that comes through. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I feel like it sounds strange because he can't see me. He has no,
I can see you fine.
how am I doing? Am I okay?
Great.
Okay.
Where'd you get the shoe?
I
I know.
I walked out of a bowling alley in these shoes, and I never brought them back. I'm sorry.
It's you know, it's dad energy. You know,
Yeah.
it's dad energy, and as a son and as a father, I'm familiar with it. And you know, my own father, I never met. He died before I was born. I feel I'm still working towards approval from him. And you know, and I've also seen with my daughter the moments and the nanoseconds that I haven't approved. It's incredibly painful for her.
Yeah.
So I think it's something that we all understand is wanting to please a parent, but it's it feels different. It feels different with fathers and mothers. It just feels different. And I think that Jimmy, there's a that creates, and Bob plays it so beautifully. There's a desperation to his desire to have Chuck hug him and tell him he's okay,
Yeah.
and for them to embrace in some way. He really wants it, even when he's angry. That's so much of that rage. And Bob, you know, as I said, Michael surprised me with how imposing Chuck is. Jimmy is so funny, but he's also so enraged. And Bob has, and it's so funny. I mean, Bob is a comedian who, and one of his well-known lines in the comedy world is, "God damn it, I can't do it the way Bob does." But Bob has, and I think some of that is actually, I don't want to speak for him, I think some of that is from Bob's dad. So it goes back to that. And Bob has that anger and that desperation that's underneath. I think it actually doesn't fight with, it sounds like it would fight with the comedy, but I think it actually makes the comedy, for me anyway.
So let's talk about the biography of Chuck a little bit, and just sort of clarify a few things. We saw their mother die in season 2. Is that right? What happened to their father?
Well, he went out of business. He sold the store, and he just got into debt with some help from the very light-fingered Jimmy, or that's according to Chuck. And he died within a year afterwards, right?
I think that's right.
Yeah.
What is the age difference between the brothers? Did you ever?
Oh, let's not go into that. It's at least 10 years, obviously, you know. And we said let's settle on that.
Well, the reason why I ask that is because and I've witnessed this with my own children. My children are 6.5 years apart. And when you're that far apart, the older sibling basically becomes kind of a parent or an associate parent,
Right.
because they're no longer in competition. One of them is developmentally so much more advanced than the other one, and I'm wondering if that isn't an aspect of it too. That he really is like he's craving the approval of his dad, because his dad was not as much of a presence as his older brother.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I also think that one of the real struts of this shaky relationship is that Chuck went off to college probably at 16, probably had his law shingled by the time he was 23, and he was the very model of the good son. And meanwhile, this kid, not pointing at you, Peter, this kid Jimmy is screwing up left and right, and it's very much that, you know, if you're a person, let's say, who is gotten your shit together and you're no longer drinking and doing terrible things, and there's a younger sibling who is still screwing up, you're going to be the one that they call on. Even if your parents are both alive, look, could you come and could you talk to Phil, or, you know, and that's, boy, if you're trying to be a grown-up, you don't want to have to go back and parent your little brother.
Right.
You know, not to make too much of a meal of it, but that's something very central to their relationship, I think. You know, defecation through the odd sunroof aside, it's still a complicated relationship, and you know, there's a lot more to sweep up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, then that brings me to my next question, which is who was looking out for Chuck? during that time? Because there's a tremendous anger in Chuck, and it's a very controlled sort of anger, but you feel it. And I wonder if some of the, that sort of intimidating, almost like lethal ray of disapproval that Jimmy feels coming from Chuck isn't really about Jimmy, that it's about the responsibilities that you're talking about that were foisted upon him, that he didn't get to have. He didn't get to have his
Absolutely.
20s, probably.
No, that's
You know.
absolutely right. Yeah. I think you just answered the question better than
Yeah.
I could. That's very definitely an element.
Yeah, and that aspect of it, is that something that you keep in your mind when you're playing this character? Do you keep a biography in your mind when you're playing this
No,
character?
because I mean, we don't do that in life.
Yeah.
We have the discussion we're having. We have the scene we have. We go after what we want in our life. We're not necessarily. It's always ammo, though. It's always, you can always say, well, you know what? I helped you out when you screwed up, so you owe me this. That is not something that he would articulate, because then it would kind of be about debts and stuff. And I don't think we don't do that in life. We talk about what we're talking now, and we do what we're doing now, but it's all deep background.
What about do you have a, I almost hesitate to use a word, but do you have a process when you're preparing to play a character? Do you have a method? If it's not the method, do you have a method that works for you?
I figure out what the character is trying to do, and I said something the other day which was sort of smart, so I have to repeat it. It was totally accidental. I said, somebody was saying, well, what is Chuck's opinion of his illness, for example? What is Chuck's opinion of his affliction? And I said, well, I always had to take it as if it were really the truth, if it was really something I was feeling, because that's what was written. And the key for me was, if your assignment is to play a person who thinks he sees unicorns, you can't play a person who thinks he sees unicorns. You have to play a person who sees unicorns. Otherwise, it's not going to land right. So the process was very much Chuck doing what he needs to do, getting towards health, and viewing it as something that is beatable. Even after the revelation of the battery in episode 5, which I still haven't seen, so don't spoil it for me. It doesn't change the fact that he's really feeling it. It makes him wonder about where the cure lies. If it's not in the pills I'm taking, if it's not in therapy, then it has to be something else. It has to be questions that I have to answer. We never got around to the questions, really. Well, you'll make up your own mind whether we do or not in episode 10. But it's been very interesting. Just figure out what your character wants and go get it. That's my method.
I just love the beautiful scene you have with Clea Duvall here in this episode, where it feels to me like Chuck is becoming aware, or he's experimenting with the thought. Maybe this isn't real. Maybe this shrink may have a way to help. It is helping, and so does that mean it's not real? And
That's what he needs to know.
He's really it's for me it's a tremendously hopeful. This whole episode that you guys just watched is true. There's hope for this character. For me,
he hasn't had a person to speak to that he can be that honest with.
Yeah.
Imagine that. Imagine having nobody in your life that you can be honest with.
Yeah. Your performance in that scene is more, what's the word? Disclosing. It's more,
Yeah.
You're more open in that scene than I think in any other scene on the show to date. Where does that come from? I mean, within the context of the scene,
Yeah.
is it because it's somebody who's a neutral observer? Or,
Well, it's somebody that I trust on some level.
yeah.
I trust her because she's a professional, but also because we've been through a couple of beats of this with her.
Right.
And she's seen me at my worst, and she's the first one to pull a trick on me, in that the little gadget on the end of the bed in season 1,
Right.
where she has a little juice running and I can't see it, but everybody else can. I don't know. I still, at this point in this episode, I don't know that happened.
Right.
But I know there's something about her that I can trust. The fact that she has busted me without me knowing it is just kind of an interesting irony. But I think it's partly because she's a professional and also because he respects her intelligence. And he does need somebody. I think that's one reason he's collapsing from the outside, is there's nobody on the inside with him. You know, he had a wife. He loved his wife very much. How warm was their relationship? We don't know. But still, it was something that worked for him. And it was I can't imagine going through my life without my wife.
Annette O'Toole, ladies and gentlemen.
She's heard this shit before.
You seem like you had, Peter, something you wanted to add to this, or?
I like Annette too.
I meant before that.
No, I think to me it's I just reiterate what's already in the show. It just Chuck goes through his hero's journey after that. There's that great scene where he goes and has to brave all the electricity out in downtown Albuquerque in order to call this doctor played by Clea Duvall. And you know, it's interesting, folks. I know people in the audience, from what I've heard, really despise this character, which I understand, but I don't. I personally don't. I think if you can't really write these characters if you despise them. I can't. And especially when you've been working for 3 years with a character. You can't despise them. The danger, though, is that because of your, I think there is a danger to that, though, because of the writers and producers' love or affection for an actor. You can start going easy on the character and having them escape consequences or softening their edges, or worst of all, trying to make them likable. And I don't mean that I find Chuck likable, but I do find him sympathetic, and especially in these episodes this season, because he is now engaged in a fundamental struggle with his idea of the world, and I'm rooting for him. At least I am rooting for him to succeed here.
I understand what you mean. Yeah.
I don't think you can play someone you despise either. I mean, you can in a broad comedy. You can be like Steve Carell in Despicable Me.
Yeah.
Or you know what I'm talking about, or Will Ferrell's character in the Zoolander movies. It's the delight in being despicable is kind of what makes it funny. But I don't. I worked with Helen Mirren once, and she played this really awful woman, and she said something. She said, whenever I have to play someone who's really terrible, I try and imagine, if it's not in the script, I try to imagine what terrible thing was done to her to make her, and that's, it's kind of what you got to do. You have to make a logical life out of what you're given to work with. These guys gave me a lot of background, and every week it was kind of another wonderful script, so win-win.
I wrote a piece last year, I think it was called something like In Defense of Chuck. I have sympathy for Chuck, and I always have had sympathy for Chuck. I don't know why, if I'm just wired wrong, that I don't hate Chuck. I kind of feel for the guy, and I still get in arguments about that piece with people who don't like Chuck, and I find I'm like in there doing the Lord's work for Chuck. It's crazy, and but what it often boils down to is this idea, which we've discussed before in a different setting, that Jimmy does the wrong thing for the right reasons and Chuck does the right thing for the wrong reasons. What do you think of that?
I think that's part of it, but there's also something that we learned in Breaking Bad, which was once you set who your protagonist is, and you've kind of once the audience understands the world, the way the protagonist sees it, you really, as an audience, in the audience, you really lock into that. You hold on to that first impression of all the characters. And one of the things that, in Breaking Bad, we realized very early on that Walt was somebody who was, even though somebody I had tremendous empathy for and interested in, he was ultimately a despicable human being who was doing terrible things for bad reasons.
And telling himself they were good reasons.
But
There was one overarching good reason. to not leave his family destitute.
Yes, but he had opportunities to avoid that without doing the terrible things that he
And
did.
then he liked it, as he told us.
That's exactly. And so we realized what we did was we kept experimenting with, how much can we give. Vince really experimented, I should say, because everything on Breaking Bad, you really have to ultimately comes back to Vince. But it was fascinating to see how the show experimented with how much bad shit Walt could do and still have everyone rooting for him. And whereas Skyler, who did, her transgressions were, in my mind, relatively minor compared with the other characters, and she, Anna Gunn had to suffer through really scary stuff because of the emotions that were unleashed. And so I think it's not the same because we don't have there's a gender element to that. I think when you're these stories, we talk about them like we really understand them, and in some ways we do. But any really good story that you get emotionally involved with goes to all kinds of deep, crazy levels that I don't think we can fully articulate. And if you could fully articulate and pull it apart, or at least if I could, then it's almost like it would just be dead on the table. So that's it. But I think that this is a case where we're talking about, and Michael now with the beard looks a lot like God. So it's we're talking.
I was
about,
going for Santa, but okay.
There's a lot of similarities there. Santa, anyway, it's another story. I don't know where the hell I'm going with that, but it's just it's we're unleashing certain things. I would say that I have forgotten the question completely. I could keep going.
Jimmy doing the right thing for the wrong
Jimmy
reasons
do-
versus
yes.
the reverse.
Yes, I think that's true to some extent, and I think one of the things that we're fascinated by in the show is that doing things legally is not necessarily the same as doing the right thing. And one of Nora and I, my wife, when I just went up to Stanford Law School to talk to, we actually showed an episode and then talked about the ethics. And one of the things I learned about lawyers is that's the hardest, those first couple of years of law school, according to these law teachers, the most difficult thing is for students to make the distinction between what their personal ethics are and what the law is. And the truth is that we all have an internal compass about what's right and what's wrong. And it doesn't always line up with the law. We need the law because it's supposed to be something that we can sort of all agree on, because all our compasses point a little bit differently. But we're fascinated by that because there are characters who, by their own lights, they're all behaving in a justifiable way. I mean, certainly Mike. Mike is one of the most, by his own lights, he is struggling with ethics constantly.
Yeah.
And he probably sees himself as clearly as any of the characters and is probably the most hard on himself of any of the characters. So I think those are questions of like how, what is, it's ultimately in stories, that's the thing you ask yourself, what's the right thing for the character to do? What should, and that's the question we ask in our writer's room all the time is, what should the character do? Given these circumstances, what should the character do? What is the right decision for this character right now? And oftentimes the characters don't want to do that.
Right. Well, here's where it gets a little bit geeky, I guess, I would say, because I want to just stay on this for a second. When I argue with people about Chuck, when I act as the defense attorney for Chuck...
Thank you for standing up for Chuck.
My pleasure. If we go for a second, if we assume that this template of Jimmy does the right things for the wrong, does the wrong thing for the right reasons, and Chuck does the wrong thing for the right thing for the wrong reasons, here's the thing about that. If you do the wrong thing for the right reasons, and everyone collectively agrees, yeah, he did the wrong thing for the right reasons, that could be the difference between a prison term versus a suspended sentence. It would be considered an extenuating circumstance, and everyone would be quite interested in your motive for doing the wrong thing. However, if you do the right thing, who cares if you did it for the wrong reasons? The two things don't seem equal to me, and I find it interesting that, and I should have just printed it out. I had a Facebook argument that went on for days about Chuck. We should have just scrolled it like it was, the opening of Star Wars. But almost everybody was saying, yes, but nothing that Jimmy has done that is unethical or immoral is as bad as what Chuck has done emotionally to his brother.
Well-
Like they're willing to forgive anything, any sort of transgression that Jimmy commits to get what he wants, but Chuck being mean to his brother is unforgivable.
You know, you should. You're going to have a new chapter for your argument
Yeah?
in the rest of the season. Let's put it that way. And don't forget, Jimmy. You know, towards the end of this episode, Jimmy gets a drug dealer out of community service for $800 or was 700, right?
$700,
700, 800.
yeah.
I keep saying 8 because it's episode 8. For 800 for $700. I'm going to say it again. It's $700. And that is something different. That's something we haven't seen from this guy.
Yeah.
He also in this episode finally does a slip and fall to get what he wants.
Right.
Yes.
Was that him? Was that him?
That is. Oh, I'm so glad you're asking that. And that is a lot of that is Bob, and some of that is a stunt artist. And we had our amazing visual effects team
It's
had a hand in.
perfect.
Oh,
It's perfect.
Oh boy, you know Diane Mercer, our post producer, would
Oh,
be so happy to hear you
Lord.
say that.
Oh, she-
That was
Well,
a
listen,
very,
I mean,
very
a lot of people think I can play the hell out of the piano now, and I ain't much of a piano player,
was-
but there's just that little, oh, yeah, he's really doing it.
We
No.
really wanted to do a shot where you could see his face and see him turn away and then see him fall, and it turned out to be quite challenging, and it's also in broad daylight.
Yeah.
So it was.
It's a more impressive visual effects display than anything I've seen in a Marvel movie, honestly.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, that's all credit also to Bill Pulowski, who is our visual effects supervisor and does an incredible job. And Dimer, and frankly, the whole post. You know, it's a hidden aspect. Now you got me on another soapbox. It's a hidden aspect that we don't really talk about. Is how important post is to all of everything that we do, and there's a lot of reasons why we don't talk about it, because part of it is it's always, if you start taking things apart, it always sounds like, if you don't say it right, it sounds like people on the set or people further up the line did something wrong, because that's always the joke, is that the buck stops there. But
We'll fix it in post.
our post team is really it's an unrivaled group of creative people who are deeply emotionally engaged in the story. If you heard how Kelly Dixon, who cut this episode, talks about the characters and her emotional investment in Chuck and Jimmy, she and Skip McDonald, who is our other editor, they are just remarkable artists, and they have a lot of just a lot of creative energy that goes into making this what it is.
Now, obviously, you have sympathy for a character who you play and who you've been playing for 3 seasons now. Yes. I wonder, though, if you were somehow able to just magically detach yourself from this guy and just see him as a character on a TV show, would you understand the point of view of people who hate Chuck?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I would watch this show even if it was somebody else doing this role, and I would probably feel the way they do. But I like to think that I would understand it. I would like to understand it as understanding both sides, really, understanding Chuck's and Jimmy's. And I think that's ideally the way you have to do it. Much as Walter White's ethics were deeply challenging to a person who doesn't break the law a lot. You know, I stayed with him. I stayed with him, and even when he did things where it was like, oh no, no. Next episode, there I was back rooting for him again on some level, but it wasn't as simple as rooting. You were just watching a really, really interesting story unfold. So I think so. Yeah.
And there was a touch of the Count of Monte Cristo to that whole thing, where it's like, what can he get away with next?
Yeah.
And you kept escalating it.
I think there is a trick. Is it okay if I disclose a trick?
Sure.
And this is to all the writers and filmmakers. I'm assuming some of you are in the audience.
There's a bunch.
One of the big tricks that I've learned over the years is the character has to want something. Notice when Michael was talking about the way he analyzes scripts is what is the character trying to accomplish. If you have a character with a great desire, that that character is going to usually be very interesting. If it's somebody who really wants something and who can be either emotionally or physically hurt. Emotionally, I think is better, because physically hurt's kind of easy to express. Emotionally hurt is you can do a lot more with in some ways. But I think I think if there's any, and we make it sound like drama is so complicated, and maybe it is, but there aren't really that many rules. A lot of it is just kind of feeling your way through it. But that's one thing that's always stood me in good stead. If there's a character who really has a great desire, a passion, a need for something, and the more specific it can be, that tends to work better. And so for Chuck has this whole knot of desires that all are expressed very clearly by Michael in his scenes, and that's one of the things that makes drama go. For me, obviously, not everyone works that way.
Also, a lot of the things that he wants are things that are gone, things that he used to have. He used to have this marriage. He used to have a great stereo. Listen, everything. And sometimes regaining what you had is a greater quest than looking for something new. There was a time when Jimmy stayed back in Cicero and I was the king of Albuquerque. That is something he's trying to engineer again. But like I say, regaining it is even more frustrating than going on to the next chapter.
So I had one clip that I wanted to show because it's so far my favorite moment of the entire season, which is the end of the courtroom episode. I've watched that scene probably 7 or 8 times, and I still have a hard time watching the part where you get the catch in your voice, and it becomes so helplessly angry at the unfairness of it. How many times did you do that?
I don't like to think about it.
Yeah.
It was like 30 pages of dialogue in that sequence, and it was endless. But fun too, really fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, notice as I'm sure it's obvious to everyone, that's one unbroken take.
Yeah.
And it's again, talking about editing, this is beautifully edited because Skip holds on this, and we don't see the reactions of everyone in the courtroom until Michael has his little break at the end, and it's everybody working together. Also, I have to give credit, by the way, to Gordon Smith, who wrote the episode, and Dan Sackham, who directed it. And they both did both.
But I never thought about what they were going to use. I just, we just did it over and over, because you have to. So I don't know, but we didn't know what they were. This is the first I've seen it, by the way. I've only seen the first.
You don't watch this. You're
Well,
not keeping up with the show. You're on what are you now? 3 or 4?
I've seen the 3 episodes. But it's largely because...
This season, though.
This season. Yeah, no, I've seen everything. But it's like, I don't like to watch alone because I feel like Norma Desmond with her own movies. So I like having friends and family around. And we've just been geographically separated, a lot and kind of busy. I've been doing this play, and my wife was doing a play. And it was just we just kind of got behind in our business. So I've been avoiding it. I mean, we'll catch up like the rest of America. So.
Well, I wonder if you would maybe take a couple of questions. That'd be okay?
Sure.
All right. Okay. If you can put the house out, that's great. All right.
Hey, by the way, how good was Michael Mando in this episode?
Oh yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I mean, all that close-up magic with the pills and everything.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like I see it on paper, but
The trembling.
Oh, he's so
It really seems like it's really
wonderful.
hard to
He's
tremble
so
on
good.
purpose and make it look like you don't mean to do
Yeah,
it.
no, it's really he put us right there. It was lovely.
Yeah.
Will we ever see is a tough question, because obviously we're still working on the show. So it's hard for me to say whether we're going to see that. It's something that it's something we've always been interested. Let's put it this way: it's something we're interested in, and we've given it a great deal of thought. We've given it a great deal of thought. I think I'll leave it at that.
Same answer.
Okay. Anybody else? What year is it supposed to
It's
be?
2002.
I think we're 2003 now.
2003.
And Yeah, the craziest thing. That
It's hard to
we've
tell
done-
because we never had a Christmas episode.
Well,
That's usually how you can time.
you know,
things,
you're
yeah.
so.
Or Richie goes off to college. You know.
And the seasons don't change too, which is something that we started on Breaking Bad. We got away with it for some reason. There were a lot of dates because I guess it's because it's a show about a lawyer. There are a lot of dates, so we're a little bit more specific about the time period now. I will say the thing that comes to mind, and not to be a tease, but the biggest thing that comes to mind is something that happens in episode 10 of this season, and we went to great lengths to recreate something that was very, very common in 2003 and just doesn't exist anymore today. So I think was probably the biggest single thing that we've done. And of course, the other thing is that we have a world.
You just broke the internet. You realize that?
Well, there's a scene in episode 10 that I'm a great fan of for this very reason, and will be a great blast of nostalgia to anyone who was an adult in 2003. So that's the one that comes to mind. We also work actually getting cars of the right vintage is a tremendous problem, especially because we like beaters. And it turns out the government was actually crushing it was, what was it, cash for clunkers
Yeah.
for quite a while. And so there were a lot of nasty old cars that were sold back for $600 or $800 that were crushed that we could really use right now. So that is a continuing problem. And be honest, if you look closely, you'll probably see cars which did not exist in 2003. For that, I apologize.
So the vintage car dealers who happen to hold on to their 2003 models, they've got shrink-wrapped stacks of cash in a storage facility.
Oh yeah, our we've had to get doubles on cars too, and our transportation captain Dennis Milliken has gone through many states searching for another Esteem and for other. I don't want to give anything away because Esteem is hard to find. Esteem is very hard to find. We've got them all.
Yeah.
This is a very interesting question. Believe it or not, we talk about this all the time. In fact, the writers' room has been closed since the end of the last year, and we just had we brought everybody back on their own time, unpaid, to talk about this and some other things. And I think the truth is that what we want to do is to tell the story as best we can, and not overstay our welcome. And it's the thing one of the things I'm most proud of in Breaking Bad was that. The show ended, in my mind anyway, just at the right moment. And there was not a moment where you say, "Oh, is that still on?" And the truth is that we've been going now. It's been 10 years since Breaking Bad started. This operation that in Albuquerque has been going on for a long time now, and we really don't want to overstay our welcome. We just want to tell the story of these characters as best we can. So the answer is we're still trying to figure it out. And obviously the other thing is that we have to have people watching it, preferably with commercials, watching it to keep us on the air. So and we're in a crazy time in show business where smaller audiences can keep a show going. But there's always a limit. There's some kind of magic alchemy that they do at Sony and AMC that's kept us on the air up to now. Whereas our audience, back in network days, we would have been canceled after Act 1 of Breaking Bad probably. So it's hopefully we get the also the audience, because it's an expensive endeavor. I wish I could answer that question. I know it existed before we opened a writer's room. It was Vince and I. At the very beginning, and at the very beginning, we're taking long walks while he was finishing the very last few episodes of Breaking Bad. So we walked through all the back alleys of Burbank, and somewhere in there was the idea of a brother. And I don't know how electricity came up. I wish it's very hard. It's very hard to tease out sometimes how ideas emerge.
You could make up a story that you and Vince were flying a kite.
That's it. That's it. We were flying. Anyway, there you go.
See?
We'll just come to you whenever we have one of
I should
these.
write for you.
That you should. You're talking about the Omaha stuff
Cinnabon.
with Cinnabon with Gene. obviously, we're
my
still
God.
we're still working on the show. It's hard to say, and I don't want to ruin anything. I'll say I'm fascinated by Gene. I love watching Gene. I love watching Bob play Gene. I love Gene, the evolution of a guy who can't shut up to save his life, who always has something to say, into a guy who's a scared mouse. The way Gene is, I think there's a lot more to say about Gene. So I would love personally, I'd love to see more Gene. I don't know whether that's hopefully will it'll be nice. I don't.
Writer, actor, bowler. Okay.
I think Chuck is a very deep character. He's got a lot going on, and there are clues in his behavior. And if you watch him through the seasons, and you watch when he has attacks of this, I think Chuck, and Michael, you can tell me if you agree. I think Chuck is a person who doesn't understand his own feelings that well. So if he feels guilty, maybe he's not even fully aware of it. I think he's a person who has a lot going on inside him that he's not completely aware of. So I think that probably almost anything you can think of that might be going on inside Chuck might actually be there, but he's got it well tamped down.
There was a moment in this episode where he says to Dr. Cruz, he says, "What if this is all in my head? What have I done?" Because this was, his illness, Jimmy's treatment of it, his subsequent betrayal of Jimmy. That's the house of cards he's built, and it's collapsing. So I think there is certainly in that particular scene, there's an element of that.
When you're playing Chuck, when he is most affected by his illness, what are you doing physically there? What are you thinking of?
Well,
how do you get to that place?
I was given a long list of possible symptoms, and I mean, there's in 4 or 5 in season 1. When I'm in the hospital, I tell Dr. Cruz, this is what I'm feeling. It's a whole page full of stuff. And I've had a lot of those feelings. I've had pain. I've had nausea. I've had vertigo. But not all together. So I established this, which is really feeling for a pulse. Just knowing that if I check my pulse, if my heart is racing, I have to take it easy. It's not something I've had to do in my life, but it just occurred to me that might be a physical of something that could visually be an expression of what he's feeling.
Have you ever been contacted by somebody who suffers from this disorder?
Yes, kind of second-handedly. I've had people say yes. Well, a friend of mine. I've known a lot of people who were the thing we have in L.A. or in Southern California called the Santa Ana winds, which are these hot, dry winds. Raymond Chandler knew all about them. Mm-hmm. And there were people who felt physically ill when that was happening. The dryness combined with the heat, combined with the motion of the air, made them irritable, nauseous, gave them headaches, made their skin crawl. So, it's something that I could legitimately put together something. I didn't sit down with a bunch of sufferers from electromagnetic hydro. You helped me out with that. So those big, long words I can only say once, and then they're gone. The hypersensitivity, it's not something I feel, but I kind of put together from things that I have felt in the past.
Do you ever carry Chuck home with you after you're done shooting?
No.
No?
No, I don't do that. I just stop and get a bite and go home and watch TV, or whatever.
All right. Well, on that note,
Can I tell one really quick story?
No, please do.
This is about the very birth of interactive media. There was a great character comedian named Jimmy Durante. Does everybody know who Jimmy Durante was? So it must be. Very funny guy, big nose, just kind of a lunatic. He came from vaudeville, did a lot of radio, big star on the radio, big star on TV. So one day, and it's probably in the 40s, he's pitching ideas with his writers. I don't think I've ever told you this story. He's pitching. I wasn't there. I'm not that old. This is something I read in Max Wilkes' book, actually. And they were pitching jokes, pitching ideas for the radio show they were doing. So one of the writers pitches an idea that's a little bit blue. Pitches a joke that made everybody in the room laugh. And everybody laughs, and then Jimmy says, no, that's too much. And the writer says, no, we can get away with it. Come on, it's a little double meaning, but we can get away with it. No, look, guys. I was taking the train in from Philadelphia into the city, and we were stuck on the tracks, or some branch on the tracks or something. We were stuck there for a little while. And I looked out the window. It's late at night, it's dark. And near the railroad track is this little shack, this little house. And I look in there, and there's this guy sitting all alone. I can see him through the window, and he's just sitting there in a bathrobe, and he's got his radio set next to him. And that's my audience. It's the people who count on me to entertain them and to bring them company. And I don't want to offend him. I think that joke would offend him. So everybody in the room goes, wow, that's really something, Jimmy. 5 minutes later, Durante pitches the bluest joke. Pitches just filthy joke. And everyone laughs. And then one of the writers says, Jimmy, what about the guy in the shack by the railroad tracks? And Durante says, fuck him. That was the birth of interactive media, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.